To start the recording. Okay, welcome. Got a little bit of a cold. I got some hot tea that I'm going to drink in a couple minutes. So we're continuing now. Basically, the unit we're dealing with is called the unit on Noahides and Rabbis. Our intention, of course, is to get to a discussion of to understand how Noahide should actually, a rabbi choose rabbis, which rabbis should be choosing and why. So we started off this unit discussing the biblical basis of rabbinic authority, how the rabbis have quite a large amount of authority given by Hashem to make judgments. And last time we were here, we started to discuss the tradition, how we get from the biblical times until today. Now, last time we started from the giving of the Torah all the way down to the 11th century with the closing of the yeshivas in Babylonia. Too many yeshivas when the Seljuk Turks took over and caused a whole change in the social situation, making it different. Now, just to recap very quickly, we have a direct connection from Moshe all the way down to the destruction of the first temple. There we have a group of people who were there, like the last of the prophets, like Haggai and Zechariah were there. And then we have the beginning of the next group of people, starting with Shimon the Tzaddik, going all the way down to the destruction of the temple. And from there, going to the Mishnah, which was put together around 200. The reason for it being done then is because the Roman Empire had at that time slipped into a period of chaos. Okay, with the closing of the Mishnah, we find the center of Jewish learning starting to move towards Babylonia. There were always communities in Babylonia, but it started moving towards there, and the establishment of the yeshiva there. This leads to, until we get to the time when first the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud get closed a few centuries later. I'm talking about the end of the 6th century. During that time, there were various events going on in the Holy Land itself. The situation under Rome and the Byzantine Empire was just horrible. While there were always communities in there, the stature of those communities were never as high as it was in Babylonia. So we see from the time of the Talmud that it's actually a great decline there, a rise up of Torah learning in Babylonia. And this continued until the end of the Talmud, which was, at that time, there was both persecution in Babylonia and also in the Persian Empire. That goes into another period where once they had the Talmud written down, we'll call it Bain Savaroi, they put together the Talmud, they divided up pretty much into the type of sections we have now. They made some of the minor tractates. It was like a in-between period. That led into the period of the Gaonim, a little bit different. And this period of the Gaonim goes until the 11th century, primarily in Babylonia. That's where the main center of Torah learning was, main center of gravity. And from there, Torah went out to all the communities. There are communities in Spain, North Africa, and in Europe. Also in the Holy Land. No, I didn't mention it last time, but in the Holy Land itself, we have the Masoretes who are putting together and purifying all the text to make sure, because with writing sometimes little errors come into it. So they gave us what's the Masoretic text, which is the what's authoritative. Now, the text that we have in the Masoretic text is essentially not much different than what they refer to some of the proto-Masoretic texts, things we find like condensed scrolls. But again, they were active in Eretz Yisrael because in the land of Israel, Hogan, because there were communities in places, but I'm only talking about those where the main communities were going on. There are communities in Europe, as I mentioned last time, under Charlemagne, the Jewish community went from Italy to Germany in Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, the main three cities, but Mainz was the first one there. In Spain, also there were communities. So there were Jewish communities in different places, but the center of Torah learning was in Babylonia. Now, with the coming of the Seljuk Turks, which basically caused the collapse of the yeshivas that were in Babylonia, the center started moving. Now, rather than being one center, there were actually two centers. And these two centers are very interesting because you can basically divide them up by the religion that was dominant. So you had the center, which became, we started calling Ashkenaz in Germany, which was under the Christians. And that included other places like Provence, which is in southern France. That whole area there is called Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is another name for Germany, but that was basically those people who were under the Christians. Whereas there were others, Spain in the beginning, and later Spain, not the reconquest we're going to talk about in a minute, but Spain in the beginning, North Africa, even Israel. But the main places where there was actually Torah learning, there were less Torah learning centers under Islam than there were under the Christians. The main Torah places of learning were in North Africa and Spain, we'll see. Israel, there was always people there learning, but it was not on that level that it was really the Torah center. People had Torah, they learned, they can get, but it really wasn't on the level that that's a value to talk about now. Our main purpose of talking now is just to get down to understand rabbis today, where they come from, sources, and things of that nature. So let's continue here. Now, after the fall of the yeshiva, the yeshivas, the Gaonim under Seljuks in Babylonia, we enter a period of time which is called the time of the Rishonim. Rishonim means the early ones, okay? Now, this period of the Rishonim spans from about 1040, when the last Goyen, Reb Hai Gaon, died, and there was basically a collapse, until approximately 1440, the middle of the 15th century. Some have it a little earlier, some have it a little later. And basically, as I pointed out, the divisions of time is because there was a recognition of a qualitative change in the learning that was going on. And a lot of this, as we know, as I mentioned, the Seljuk Turks came in and conquered the area of Babylonia, so that caused a change in there. A lot of these things are reactive to sociological conditions and the political situations around the Jewish people. We'll see that again and again coming up, a theme that we're going to have here as far as the historical side rather than that. It is the constant how the political situation, how the sociological situation changes because of the politics, and how that affects centers of learning and where the center of learning is. Now, at this time, there were multiple centers for the Rishonim. So let's deal first with those that were essentially under Muslim control, which is basically North Africa and in the beginning under Spain. Now in North Africa, very interesting, North Africa was a very, very important center right after the period of Gaonim. But we have to understand historical situations, what are going on. Until the 12th century, North Africa was a vibrant center. In the 12th century, what happened is in Morocco, in the area there was a group of people called the Almohads, who were fanatical Muslims. And under them, there were forced conversions. And basically, there was a collapse of Torah learning in North Africa under them. North Africa was never again a center of learning. However, before that, there were actually three extremely important people there. One is extremely important to know because it has an effect on the halachic process that we have today. But two others are very important. One's Rabbi Hanano, who was his Talmud commentaries are very popular. The other was Rabbi Nissim, who also his Talmud commentaries are very popular, very well known. But the third one, who's most important to remember as far as what our purpose here is, the Rif. Rav Al-Fasi. Al-Fas Fez is from Morocco. Al-Fasi is his name. We called the acronym the Rif. His commentary on the Talmud is extremely important. What happens in hidden time, there was a prohibition to learn the Talmud. So what he did is he went through the Talmud itself from the beginning to the end, and he excerpted from there the halachic decisions, the legal decisions that were there, and made it into a book by itself. And that's what people learn. It's called the Rif. And as far as learning halacha is concerned, that's extremely significant and important because he basically concentrated on the final decisions there. Okay, that was North Africa. Now, Rabbi Hanana was from basically the 10th to the early 11th century. He's At the same time, it was the last from the Goinim, as was the Bani Nissim. They were also about the time of the last Goinim. Whereas the Rif was after the Goinim, and he died around 1103. And then the 12th century occurred with the Almohads, and that basically brought an end to in North Africa. Now, the next area we want to talk about, again, is being under the Muslims. These are the areas which are going to be called Sepharad. Sepharad is a name for Spain, but in general, it's used as a name for those lands which were under the Muslims. So nowadays, for example, we would talk about there's not many Jews that left in Egypt or other places like that. There were Jews who had lived in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Iran, lands like this. These are called Sephardic lands, sometimes called the Adas Mizrach, the congregations in the east. But essentially, they're considered Sephard. And again, the basic category of Sephard really is those who were under Muslim rule, as opposed to Ashkenazim were those who were under Christian. So in Spain, again, the period of time, we could really talk it a little bit longer, the Shonim, basically until the time of the expulsion from Spain and Portugal. But it's very important. There are certain events historically that take place that we should be aware of. One, and most importantly, is called the Reconquista. The Reconquista is essentially the reconquest by the Christians of the Spanish Peninsula. Now, Spain had been a Christian country under the Vandals and on the Ostrogoths. It was a Christian kingdom, but under the early Umayyad Muslim kingdom, they conquered all the way up almost to Spain. They lost a battle in Poitiers, I think. It was a battle with Charles Martel in around the 700s, 714, something like that. And that stopped incursions into Europe through Spain. And essentially, there was the Reconquista. Now, it's called the Reconquest. Historically, just an interject, the Reconquest in Spain is actually one of a number of crusades that were going on. Everybody talks the Crusades. They think about what happened in the Holy Land, but the Crusades actually were going on in different places and were attempts by Christians to reconquest areas that the Muslims had taken over. And Spain was actually the most successful. Other ones were not successful. But it was basically an attempt to reconquest lands that had been Christian lands and bring back under Christianity. So the more thing is, of course, remember the Reconquista. Now, as that was going, there were also various things going by the Muslims. So we have to remember the Almohads, which I mentioned, North Africa, took over Spain. So the whole area was the Almohads until the Reconquista sort of pushed them out. Okay. Now, the problem with the Almohads is understood is that as fanatical Muslims, they actually were involved in forced conversions of Jews. So there's a famous forced conversion of Jews in 1148, which occurred under the Almohads. Okay. At that time, many Jews actually became like Marranos under them, in that they openly acted as if they were Muslim, but they were keeping Jewish Torah privately. Okay. It's historically interesting to understand that this was something that was common there. Besides that, there were a number of important events that took place within Spain, which affected the destruction of the Jewish community. In the year 1369 to 70, there was a Spanish Civil War. Two brothers fought over who should be king in Spain, and the Jews were basically caught in the middle. And during that time, there were thousands of Jewish people who were killed, causing a depopulation. But probably worse, and as a signal of the times to come, in 1391, there was a series of forced pogroms and forced conversions all over Spain. This led to the what we know as Marranos, Jews who openly converted, but privately kept Judaism. Now, there were many people who actually converted, and there were many kinds of disputations that took place during time. But essentially, Spain during this time was becoming very unfriendly to Judaism. And we see this in effect with the type of people, as we get later and later on, we find less and less people of importance for history. Finally, ended up in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain, and 4 years later in Portugal, 1496. Portugal, actually, there was forced conversion of children there. But essentially, that's the period of time of Rishonim in Spain, what's going on. You see that because the Christians are taking over. There were fanatic Muslims who affected Judaism there, so that they wiped out the Jewish communities. The Jewish the Jews still stayed there, but they wiped out essentially the Torah learning that was there. And that happened in Spain. And then the Reconquista, there were Jewish rabbis living at the time, and but essentially it collapsed also with the expulsion. So let's go through some of the rabbis that we have here. Some of them are important to know, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. Just some are supposed to be named because they're names you know about, but it's good to know when they lived and where. Okay. The first few we're going to talk about lived under the Muslim Spain. Shmuel Nogad was a leader there. His son was killed by the Muslims in a pogrom. Shlomo ben Gavriel is very important because he wrote works on philosophy, but also he wrote works that are part of the liturgy that is used in Sephardic lands. The next one, who lived from 1050 to 1120, again he wrote it actually in Arabic, and it was under the Muslims, was Bachya ibn Bakuda. Bachya ibn Bakuda wrote a work called Choivus Levuvus, one of the most important, and actually one of the earliest and most important works on morals. I made a post recently about the Ask Noah people came out with a posted something about a translation of in English of Shar HaBetuchen, the gate of Betuchen, meaning trust, something that it's very strongly recommended that Noahides should learn because it's a very important concept there. So he wrote Chaybas Lububis, very important, influential, all over Judaism, although he was Sephardic and in Arabic was translated. The next one is the Ri Magash. He's a very important Talmudist in the time from 1077 to 1141. He was the teacher of the Rambam's father. Okay. Following that is Yehuda Halevi. He wrote a lot of poetry which has made it into the liturgy. We say a number of his things on, say, for example, the day of Tisha B'Av, or more the temple. He used a number of things, and it's part of the liturgy. But he wrote a very important work in philosophy of Kuzari, which was a philosophical work which defended Judaism against both Christianity and Islam. Also somewhat similar to that time, a little bit later, was Avram Ibn Ezra. He is very important to remember because he is a very significant biblical commentary. We have what's called Mikras Gedolos. It's the Torah with the major commentaries. Ibn Ezra is mentioned there. His is there. Okay, his is there. Now, also, about that time, a little bit later, we have the Rambam lived in 1135 to 1204. Now, the Rambam is extremely important, of course, for Noahides because his work, Mishnah Torah, is one of the few places where he talks about the laws of Noahides in one place and explains them. And there are many commentaries of Rambam. He's very important. What's important to remember about him is he was living on the Almohads when there was the forced conversions, and because of that, he actually left Spain. He went to Egypt, where he had a position as a doctor, but also he ended up going to Israel. He's actually buried in Tiberias in Tiberia. You can visit his gravesite there in Tiberia, where he's buried there, and also his father buried there. Important to notice is that Rambam is essentially the last of the great rabbis who lived under Muslim Spain. After that, the Almohads came in, and basically in Islamic Spain, there was basically a total elimination of any rabbis of any importance. The rabbis that we're going to mention now didn't live under the Muslims. They actually lived under the Christians who were conquering Spain back. So the next people we're talking about are actually living under Christian Spain, because in the Muslims, there was a total wipeout of great Torah scholars. In fact, as we go through history, we're going to see that until essentially the Ottoman Empire, in Spartic lands, while there were rabbis there and the traditions kept on, there weren't rabbis of the high level that would come again once the Ottoman Empire stabilized and it became a place where people would go. There wasn't in the Spartic lands that type of learning as we'd find in the Christian lands. So there was suppression of Torah learning. Not that there weren't rabbis, and not that we don't know of them, but we're talking about of a certain level that are important for periods of time later on. The T. Okay. After that, again, we're doing more and more rabbis who were living in Spain under various types of persecution in Spanish. I mean, Spanish was not under Spain. They were not living, without persecution. There were certain persecutions. There were forced debates that went on. There were a number of disputations that took place. There was religious persecution, but the level of religious persecution was not great enough to affect the ability of those communities to have great rabbis and yeshivas where they could continue the traditions and continue it on. Okay, unlike in other places like in Babylonia, where the collapse was so great that there wasn't that ability. For great rabbis, there were rabbis, of course, but they're not rabbis of a certain type of stature that today we talk about them in the same way we're talking about rabbis I'm going to mention here. So the next one I want to talk about is Rabbeinu Yonah. He was a very great Talmudist. His commentaries on the Talmud are very important as far as that's concerned. But he's also known for his moralistic literature. He wrote a work called Shari Tshuva. It is about repentance, a very important classical text. And he was writing in Muslims and in the Christian Spain, so he wrote it actually in Hebrew. The next one, of course, is another person who's pretty well known. That's Ramban. That's Nachmanides Ramban. He lived from 1194 to 1270. So he spanned from the basically the 13th century. Now, among the important things, of course, he was a Talmudist. There's many, many things in the Talmud from him. He's very much a key person in the tradition of Talmud understanding and Jewish law as far as that's concerned. And of course, his biblical commentary of the Torah is, of course, very important and read. What's interesting about the Ramban, as far as that's concerned, is the Ramban is known as the first commentary that we have, which brings in Kabbalistic ideas. Okay, the ideas of Kabbalah were all over the place in Europe also. In Spain, there was a lot of philosophical ideas. Kabbalah was less known. The rise of Kabbalah came because of problems that happened because of philosophical learning there, which are a little bit outside of what we're doing. The next person that I want to mention is called the Rashba. The Rashba has a commentary specifically on halacha, on the Talmud, and his halachic responses are very important. He was from 1235 to 1310. Also, sometime around this time is a very important work, which is going to be very key for Noahide halacha to understand things. Let's go to Sefer Chinuch. Sefer Chinuch, there's some question about the tradition is that it was written by Aaron Halevi. There's some people who say from Barcelona, others say from others. Who it was from is not important. What he did is essentially, it's similar to the Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs, where he brings all the mitzvahs, but he brings it by the weekly parsha in a certain order. And this cipher itself becomes a foundation from a key text from the Achronim called the Minchas Chinuch, which we will talk about later. And that is a source for a lot of understanding of Noahide law. So it's important to understand that. This is a text that people learn all the time. After that, there's a few people. Many of these are not as important to be known, but it's important to remember. Bachim and Asher wrote a work called Divine Brachia. That's very important. And then there's Vedubit of Adraham. In halacha tradition, the Adraham is very important. 1290 to 1375 is when the Ran lived, right? And Nissen, I believe his name. The Ran is important for a few things. He has a Talmud commentary, but importantly, it's the halacha, and his is the primary commentary on the Rif. Remember the Rif we talked about from North Africa took the Talmud, and because they weren't allowed to Talmud, he took excerpts of it, basically what the law is. The Rif is the Ran is a commentary on it. So when you learn Jewish law, you're going to learn the Rif and then you're going to run as a commentary because you want to know how the Jewish law progresses and where we get to our final decisions. So that's what the Ran is. After that is Rabbani Vidal from 1300 1370, lived there. Now he's important because of what the Magen Mishnah. Magen Mishnah is a commentary on the Rambam. At this time, there was no Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam was one of the most important things. Some people wrote halachas, others. The Rambam is very important. Okay, the next one, 1326 to 1407, is a rabbi called Ravash. He wrote a number of responsa. His book are very important. He's somewhat of a minor figure, but he's one is important for other reasons as far as Judaism, because not just that. Okay, then from 1340 to 1400, there's Rabbi Yosef of Barcelona. He wrote a second important commentary on the Rif called the Nemike Yosef. Again, this is very important as far as halachic tradition is concerned. Following that, there are two people who are important because they wrote philosophical works about Jewish belief. This is something, these types of works were very common in Spain at the time. A number of them were written, whereas in Germany, in Europe, these were not as common. So from 1340 to 1415, we have Hasdai Kreskas, and he wrote a work called Or Hashem. And from 1380 to 1444, we have Yosef Alboy. He wrote Sefer Ikim. Sefer Ikim is more commonly known, but both of them are works of extreme importance. Okay, let me just take a second to break. If there are any questions, we could take questions. Otherwise, we're going to go to the Rishonim in Germany. Now, what's important to note is even though these were Rishonim that lived in Spain, that I mentioned, their influence was still throughout Judaism. The Rif is significant for Judaism in general. He's learned in Ashkenaz also. He's an important part of it. We'll see when we see the Shulchan Aruch how important that is. But it's fundamental to understand that at this time, while there was different places, the split in custom was just beginning to happen as much. We talk about the custom of Ashkenaz, the custom of Sfarad. These were coming into play starting right now. And these developed because there was no longer the main yeshiva. There were splits and had to deal with different issues in different places. So give it another minute. Any questions that anybody has? Dan? Anybody?
Hey,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yes.
What year was Hanukkah?
Hanukkah was like the 2nd century BCE.
Oh, quite a bit earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, let's continue. Now in Germany, there's a lot of history going on. So let me just go over it. Germany, while in Spain and the Sephardic country, there wasn't as much, the general persecution of Islam towards Jewish learning there was just continual. It was not like ups and downs. Whereas in Europe, there were ups and downs. So we see this, there are a number of different types of persecutions and things that happen. The first one we have to deal with pogroms. And when we deal with the pogroms, we also have to take in consideration the Crusades. The first Crusade, basically they went through Europe around the year 1096. Now, as the Crusades were going through the Rhineland and the Danube, which was essentially the center of Jewish learning, okay, they basically slaughtered communities. During the months in the spring, they went through the communities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, the three biggest communities in Germany, three most important communities, and basically slaughtered the people there. To this day, we remember it. On the 9th of Av, when we won the temple, there are actually added a number of prayers. They're called kinos. They're specifically about this because of the crusade. That was devastating to Europe. Devastating to Europe. Also, at the same time, in the beginning, in England, there were also a number of massacres, specifically in the city of York. The story in the city of York is the people went for refuge in a tower, and the Christians were coming there to kill them. They all ended up killing themselves, rather than being taken so that the children should not be forced conversions. They did that there, and this is remembered even till today. I know somebody from England who told me that there was a excommunication set for anybody who would spend the night in the city of York. You could go to York, but you couldn't spend the night. You'd have to leave there. Okay. The Second Crusade took place in 1147. Most of the problems therefore were in France. 1188 was also in France. In the 13th century, the very end of the 13th century, in 1298, there was what was they called a Rindfleisch. Rindfleisch, I think, was the name of the person in Germany, where they went through Germany and basically slaughtered many, many Jews who were living in what was we call it Germany, but in the Holy Roman Empire. Then in 1320 was called the Shepherd's Crusades in France. In 1320, the Jews that were still living in France at the time, there was a lot of slaughters going on. So that's basically the craze. They went to wipe out communities, and people fled, but they were still able to keep centers of learning. I was going to say the centers of learning still existed, but there was times under persecution that they were able to do it. Next, what occurred is actually the expulsions. The expulsions were very important because once expulsions occurred, that basically led to a total end of those communities. So France was very well known. What they would do is when one of the few jobs that Jews could do was lend money to the crown. So they would lend money. With the debts get too big, the king would nullify them and exile the Jews that are there. Then later on, he'd call them back, and they go. So during this period of time, there were a lot of expulsions from Spain, sent out and coming back. So, for example, in 1182, under the King Philip Augustus, they were sent out. In 1254, under Louis XIX, they were sent out. From 1304 to 1394, there were so many I can't even remember. I can't even mention all of them. And the two Charleses and the one Louis, a whole bunch of them. Okay, so France was constantly expelling the Jews from there and then calling them back. England was similar. In 1340, there was a temporary expulsion, but in 1290, the Jews were finally under Edward I expelled from England. They'd taken basically all the money they could get from the Jews. They expelled them, and the Jews were not allowed back in until Cromwell. Cromwell was basically after the Stuart kings. We're talking about, I think it's the 16th century, if I remember correctly. Okay, so Jews were actually expelled from England for hundreds of years. Now, within this period of time, an important event, two important events historically entered. One was in 1242 in France, they burned the Talmud publicly. There was a trial, Talmud was put on trial. There was the famous debate that took place in Paris at that time against the Talmud. Many of the important rabbis, those who we call the Tosfos, rabbis who became part of the Tosfos, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, they were forced into disputations to defend the Talmud, and the Talmud was burned publicly. They gathered together the Talmud and they burned it. Now, it's not like today where you have a PDF version, you can print it out any time you want it like that. When they destroyed it, that means it was lost. The Talmud was written by hand. So there were a lot of things done. And there were also, by the way, censorship in the Talmud. Also, the Talmuds that were in Sephardic lands, under the Muslims were not subject to the type of censorship as they were in the Christian lands. And as such, many times we've had to later correct. There's like a whole book on those things that were pulled out of the Talmud in Europe that we know about from the Talmud that was in lands that they didn't tamper with it and didn't have censorship. And the other thing of important was the Black Death in 1346 to 1350. It did affect the Jews because the Jews were cleaner as far as things that affected less, but it also led to many, many, many persecutions because blaming the Jews for it, the Jews were easy targets. So during the time of that, and of course, we also had during this period of time what was known as the blood libels. The blood libels is something that existed, and we're going to talk about later on, that actually existed. The last blood libel we know of actually existed in the 20th century. So we're not talking about something that ended. The first one we know of was in England, in Norwich. Blood libel is basically an accusation that Jews killed a Christian child because they need the blood for the Passover matzahs. As stupid as it is, that is something that cost many hundreds and hundreds of Jewish lives. England had a number of them. Gloucester, France had in Blau in 1171, England again in 1181 and 1183. Germany had their first one in 1235. Now, I'm going to mention another one because some of these people who were accused of having been killed actually were sainted. So in 1255 in Lincoln, a boy was killed. I can't remember his name, but he was eventually sainted by the church. But we find in Germany in 1270, 1287, and again in Trent in 1475 in Germany, a boy was found dead, whatever, and he was also sainted. So we see all these things going on. Again, the difference between the Jews living in Ashkenaz in Spain is essentially, in Ashkenaz, there were ups and downs, a lot more things we can talk about, ups and downs, a lot of persecutions. But through it all, the Jewish community was able to maintain a certain level of learning. And from there, we get those rabbis who are most important for us from Ashkenaz. And obviously, since most of the people who are teaching Noahides come from Ashkenaz, from there, are those people who lead up to those sources that we use. So let's just go through some of them. Again, Ashkenaz is divided into a number of places. Germany. Now, Germany, basically the father of German, the Jews of Ashkenaz, is Rabbi Gershom. He was a big Talmudist and halacha. He made a number of decrees that exist today. The most important one, of course, we know of, is one that forbids a person to marry a second wife. He was one who, in Spartak lands, there's no Torah prohibition wearing more than one wife, and in Spartak lands that actually was allowed because in Islam they allowed also. Christian countries was a little bit different. Okay, also 1055 we have the teacher Rashi, Rebbe Eliezer. He's known mostly because teacher Rashi. Rashi lived from 1040 to 1105, so he basically was from the 11th century. Rashi's influence, whether in Talmud, in law, halacha, or in Bible, he has a commentary on all of the Tanakh. He has a commentary on most of the Talmud, except for some things where his son, the Rashbam, took his place. The grandson, we'll talk about him in a second. Rashi is a very significant figure as far as our understanding of the text. Many halachic things come back to Rashi. He had a Talmud of Simcha Vitri, which I believe is in Spain. Rashi was also in Spain. And what he wrote was called the Machzor Vitri. We have it today. That involves prayers, involves Jewish law, basically telling us what the customs were for Jews in Germany at that time. Okay? Following Rashi, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud, we have what we call the Tosfos. Tosfos are commentaries. Basically, the basis of Tosfos is Rashi says something. Tosfos will say one second, we have a question of what Rashi said, either the language or it seems to be a contradiction in other places. Very much to clarify. And what's important is that these clarifications of the text, if that particular text deals with what we actually accept as halacha, these clarifications from either Rashi or Tosfos actually directly affect how we understand what the halacha is supposed to be. And this, of course, directly affects Noahides. So there were many Baba Tosfos. I can't mention all of them. I'm just going to mention a few of them that you might have heard about, even some that you might not have heard about, but who are somewhat important. The first one I mentioned is the Rashbam. The Rashbam is one of the grandsons of Rashi, and he was known for his commentaries on Talmud and also his biblical commentary. There's a commentary, the Rashbam's commentary on the Torah appears in every major text. His approach is a little more towards a simple understanding of the text, but essentially it is similar to Rashi and extremely fun and very important, one of the best commentaries there is. His brother was Rabbi Tom, who was a little bit younger than him, and obviously another grandson. The Rashbam was from 1085 to 1174. Rabbi Tom was from 1100 to 1171. Rabbi Tom is very important because he is basically the most important of the Tosfos. His views in halacha are all over the place as far as Ashkenazim are concerned. He is really one of the most important things. Okay, Sfardim also has an influence in certain ways. Okay, and among the other ones who are, I can't say they're minor, they're important when it comes to learning Talmud and stuff like that, but still there was a Yehudis Lyon, who was from France. Yechiel of Paris was very important. He not only appears in Tosfos, but he's also very important because he was one of the rabbis who were involved in the disputation in Paris. The Ben of Paris is very important. There's a collection of Tosfos teachings under his name. 1060 to 1135 is a very important commentary on the biblical text, the Torah. Yosef Kara, as opposed to Yosef Karo, who we'll talk about later from the Shulchan Aruch. The Kara, 1060 to 1135, he was a very important person as far as that's concerned. As a biblical commentary is one of the key ones and included with most texts. Rabbi Yom Tov, who was actually from France, but he was in New York in 1190 during the York Massacre. He was one of the rabbis who was murdered there. Okay, in Germany, in the 12th century, going into the 13th century, developed a group of people that we call Hasidic Ashkenaz. Now, that shouldn't be confused with the Hasidim later on. The pious Jews of Ashkenaz, they were called, because they were involved in very many strict practices, which became customary, and many of them became part of the custom and part of the Jewish law as far as Jews in Ashkenaz. Now, the father of this group was called Rabbi Shmuel ben Kalonymus, from the famous Kalonymus family, which goes back. He was not only known for that, but he also wrote, for example, he wrote poetry that we actually, on Yom Kippur night, there's a poem from him that we read. Most important, however, was his son, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, that's what it's called, and he wrote an important seminal work, extremely important until this day, called Sefer Hasidim, the book of the pious ones. It's basically a book which, well, it does have some stories of certain practices, basically about practices that pious practices people should follow. The influence of this on later generations of Jews in Germany, even until the later Hasidic movement, was great. One of his Talmudim was Eliezer Rakayach, who wrote the book Rakayach, which is also a moralistic work, basically along the same type of lines. And this is the type of moral literature that appeared there. Different from, we mentioned there was certain moral literature that came out of Spain, like Shari Tshuva and stuff like that, Lewis. This was a moralist literature that came out of there, came from the Hasidic Ashkenaz. Okay, so let's get back to the important rabbis. Again, in our tradition, which leads us up to our legal system today, laws today, how we deal with this in practical matters. The first one is Yitzchak Or Zviya. He wrote a work called Or Zviya, which is a halacha compendium of laws, Jewish law. He was from 1200 to 1260, also he lived in Germany. At the same time in France was a Moshe Kusi, who wrote an extremely important and significant work. It's called Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. It's about the mitzvahs in the Torah, and he explains it. Again, similar to what we're talking about, the Rambam and the Sefer Chinuch, that it was done in Spain. This was done in Ashkenaz with their approach to it. Okay, from 1215 to 1293, Maram Rottenberg. He was a very, very important person in both halacha and in Talmud. He was actually, it was very interesting to show that he was actually captured and held for ransom, and he refused to allow anybody to ransom him while he was alive. He actually died in captivity. But later on, somebody, next generation, 2 generations later, actually paid money to get him taken away to be buried in Jewish cemetery. But his influence in Judaism in Europe was very important. Next, we have a few other people that are important. One is Yitzhak al-Corbiel, which is in France. He wrote the Sefer Mitzvahs Cotton. It's a smaller version, similar to my Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. Again, but these are works in Europe, in Ashkenaz, which deal with the mitzvahs. Another important person is the Mordechai ben Hillel. He was from 1240 to 1298. He was murdered in the massacres in Germany in 1298. His important halachic word, it's called the Mordechai himself, and it is a compendium of the Jewish halachas based on the particular Talmud that's being discussed. Okay, now we're in the 13th century going into the 14th century. Are two people of extreme importance because they are key to Jewish law, not just for Ashkenaz. The problem with that, it's in general. The first one is Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. He fled, actually, he died in Spain. He fled from Germany there. But his work is called the Rash. The Rash is a commentary on the whole Talmud, going through discussing the legal implications, similar to what the Rif does, but the Rash does all the legal implications of what it appears in there, and it becomes the basis for halakha as far as in Ashkenaz. His son wrote a work which is even more important and influential. He called the Arbiturim. It is a book on halacha. His son was Yankov, and he also wrote a biblical commentary called the Baal Turim, which is very, very interesting as Matthew is, and it's very, very interesting to read. But as far as what we're concerned here, his most important work is in Jewish law, and that's the Turim. The Turim is divided into 4 sections. That's how the Shulchan Aruch later on divides itself into 4 sections based on that. He lived from 1275 to 1340, so he's basically 13th into the 14th century. Each section is dealing with a different subject matter. So Orach Chaim, the way of life, is basically dealing with what we do. That's what Shulchan Aruch ends up being done. But what he does is he discusses laws, he divides into section by laws, essentially the same way we have in our Shulchan Aruch now, and he discusses it, bringing in all the different various points of views that existed at that time. That work became the source of Jewish law in Europe. Even in the beginning, when the Shulchan Aruch first came out, it still wasn't as accepted as this was. It took a while until the Shulchan Aruch took over from the Torah, and it had numerous commentaries on it. The 2 of the most important ones to remember are the Beis Yosef, which is Yosef Karo, who actually wrote the Shulchan Aruch. He first wrote a commentary on this and then made the Shulchan Aruch. And then another one is the Bach, Ais Chodesh. We'll mention him. He'll come a little bit later. He's from the Achronim. He wrote on that. And the Ramu, we're going to talk about him also later, wrote a commentary on that, being the customs in Ashkenaz with this. So this is significant. When we deal with Jewish law, we want to know what the law is. Understanding, say, a passage in anything which might have a relationship to Noahides, we go after learning the other sources in the Talmud, we would go to the Torah and say, what does he bring? What are the views that he brings together so we understand what actually is a law? Okay, now let's go on a little bit more. The last person from actually France and Germany, which we're talking about, is the Madel. He was from 1365 to 1427. He wrote a book on the customs of Ashkenaz. Okay. Now we just have a few more Rishonim we'll do, basically dealing in two areas. One is Provence, which is southern France, which was always a Christian country. And there are a number of people here who you've probably heard of who are important. The first one we should know of in the early 11th century, we're not exactly sure of his dates, was a Moshe Darshan. He wrote on the Talmud and stuff like that. The next one of importance, 1120 to 1195, is the Ravid. He wrote on the Talmud, but also more important, Halacha, he has a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. The Ravid's commentary on Mishnah Torah is basically the Mishnah, the Rambam will say something, the Ravid will sometimes disagree with him. Very important. 1125 to 1186, again, is Rachi Levi. He writes Sefer Hamor. It's actually the Rambam wrote a Sefer Mitzvahs. This is a commentary. Also in Provence was David Kimchi, better known as Radak. His biblical commentary is fundamental. He lived from 1160 to 1235. I find his commentary on Nach specifically to be in many ways much more elucidated than Rashi, although we always follow Rashi as far as that's concerned. I just like the Radak very much more. Okay. Important in that time also 1249 to 1306 was Menachem Meiri. He has a commentary called the Meiri. Now the Meiri is very much quoted, but it's not as important. I mentioned him here just to know when he lived. He was from the Shon in Provence, but his works were virtually unknown until the 20th century. So what that meant was, whereas, for example, we talked about the Rambam, what he wrote, and there were multiple commentaries on the Rambam discussing and disagreeing, so we could have clarifications placed where the Rambam might not have been correct, or actually the Halacha is different. We have various commentaries, just like the Torah, there's various commentaries which interact with it. There was no interaction with the Meiri. Because as many of the Gedolim, like the Chazon Ish, say that we cannot rely on the Meiri for Halacha because he said things that even though it might be later on that were nice, whatever, that as far as Halacha is concerned, he was never subject to the type of examination and criticism as other people from that time, even Rashi. Okay, because of that, we cannot, take him as authoritative. Even though it's a Rishon, we cannot take it because he was never subjected to the type of interaction and criticism that would have been other rabbis at the time. And since we are of a level we can't criticize, so when you learn the Talmud, you look at the Meiri, and it's very important to understand Talmud. When it comes to halacha, it's a blessing. The last rabbi from the Provence we'll talk about, living from 1288 to 1344, is the Ralbag. He has a very interesting Tzvavi ben Gershom. He has a very interesting commentary on the Torah, which I find very interesting. His approach is very interesting. And also he wrote things on philosophy. Okay. Now, not to leave out, there is, of course, also in Italy, as I mentioned once before, the Jews went when they were exiled from, Judea, in the Jewish land there, they went to Italy first because they were brought to Rome. And then from Italy, they ended up going to Germany. But Italy also had a number of important rabbis. One was Nissen ben Yechiel. He died somewhere in 1102, 1106. There's a little bit of disagreement when. It's very difficult to understand. But he wrote a work called Sefer Orach. Sefer Orach is very interesting. It is basically a dictionary of Aramaic into Hebrew, because he was finding that people there, since Aramaic was no longer the spoken language, did not know what the meaning of many words. So when there's a word, sometimes it's difficult in Aramaic, you don't know what it means. He's got his word. Following that, we have Tovi ben Eliezer. He lived in the late 11th, 12th century. He wrote a very important, it's called Medrash Lake of Tov. It's more like a commentary than a medrash. He goes verse by verse and goes through it. It's almost like a precursor, similar to like Rashi would write in his commentary. Also in the 12th century was another Menachem ben Shlomo who wrote Medrash Seichel Tov. We have less of that, and they're basically commentaries, Medrashim on the Torah portions and stuff like that. 1223 to 1290, there was the Rekanti, Menachem Rekanti. He has a biblical commentary, the commentary on the commandments, very important. And then In 1230 to 1300 is Rabbi Tzadkiah Haroifa. He was a doctor. Obviously, Haroifa means a doctor. And he wrote a Sefer Shibuli Haleket, which is also a halachic compilation of laws and customs. So that basically, in a nutshell, obviously, is the important rabbis that existed in the time of the Rishonim until the end of it in different lands. Now, I'm going to take a break for a minute or two. Again, for any questions, I know we went through a lot of stuff. The important thing to take from all of this is, of course, you got to hear about some of the names you're familiar with, where they lived, and the importance of it. But the important thing to understand is that we're talking about a consistent history bound from time to time. Even though there were many persecutions and people had to leave from different places, we have histories and we have books from many people that were able to take our traditions as far as Jewish law is concerned that leads us again to today. Okay. So are there any questions of this, or I'll just take a break for a couple of minutes and see how far I can go on? No more questions? Okay, let me take a look here a second. Hold on here. Okay, now the next group are called the Achronim, and I basically divided them to two groups: the early Achronim, going from around 1440 to 1800, and the later Achronim from 1800 until the present day. Now, in addition to that, what I've tried to do is I've tried to divide them by the century. Okay, now we're going to find there's a lot more. There's a lot of names in here, and I'm only going to mention those that I know about mostly. And also, we're going to find that at this time, the real split between Ashkenaz and Sephardi really developed. The customs of Ashkenaz and customs of Sephardi, although they had always been different until then, but they became more, more distinct, much more distinct than they were before. Now, I have to admit that I am not familiar with which of the rabbis in Sephardic lands are considered of importance. So basically, I'm just bringing those people who I know about, and just trying to deal with it in that way. Okay, so there may be some person in Sfard is I left out who's important. I have to ask forgiveness for that. But basically, I'm trying to give you an idea of those who are the halacha people, and certainly there's nobody that I mentioned now who's got nobody who's important as far as being a godel, being a big person who has things on relating to Noahide laws, who's going to be left out, and we will also be able to see the tradition that goes on. Now, importantly here, there are a couple of things that have to be understood. The Achronim starts in 1440. Now, what's going on here is a number of things that are happening at the same time. In Europe, there's a considerable amount of persecution in Western Europe, and the move to Eastern Europe is taking place. In Sephardic lands, the Ottoman Empire is developed. So coming to the Ottoman Empire means that, first of all, the Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and 1496, the Ottoman Sultan welcomes them, recognizing that the Jewish people can help financially in his empire, welcomed with open arms the Jews who were fleeing from Spain. And so the Jews from Spain actually came into Ottomans are the Turks, came into Ottoman Empire, some settling in Turkey, but many of them going into the Holy Land. So we'll see a great repopulation of the Holy Land of Jewish people. Well, there were always Jewish communities there, but they were very, again, they were persecuted communities and they were much smaller. The truth of the matter is the Holy Land had very few people to begin with. So we find an influx of people that hadn't been before. So let's do it the 15th century. In the 15th century, basically, the ones I want to talk about here, there were some people I mentioned in Ashkenaz, but in Sparta, there were a few people here that were important. Basically, it's hard to consider whether to be considered Rishonim or Achronim, so I'm just going to keep these separate because they're well known, but they're also important people, specifically one Spartan. There's a rabbi called Yosef Yavetz. He was in Spain among those who were exiled from Spain. All three of these people were exiled from Spain. He wrote called Or Chaim, a commentary on a number of philosophical and other works. He was very anti-philosophy, but his commentaries on the Talmud, on the Bible itself, and it has a moral system. The next one is much more well known. That's Yitzhak Abarbanel, Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. He had been a high official in the Spanish government under Ferdinand and Isabella. When the Jews were expelled in 1492, he joined them. He went to Italy, settled there. He had his commentary on the Bible. The whole Tanakh is very important. And also he has some philosophical things. Some of his things are philosophical. The next one that I want to give is extremely important, which files biblical commentaries. His name is Eliyahu Mizrahi. He lived from 1450 to 1525. Again, he was exiled from the exiles from Spain. He wrote a work called Mizrahi on Rashi. It's a commentary on Rashi's commentary, explaining Rashi. Now, there's a whole group of commentaries. I have a number of works on it, explaining Rashi's commentary, not just the commentaries on the Talmud, like the Tosfos, but there's commentaries on Rashi that are that are commentaries of Rashi itself that came about. Okay, now we get to the 16th century. 16th century, let's give a little bit of history. In 1501, the king of Poland welcomes the Jewish people to go to Lithuania. This leads to an influx, but most importantly, in 1580, there was founded what's called the Council of Four Lands. I believe that was Poland, Lithuania, Russia. Not sure what the fourth one was. Maybe Germany. Which was a council, almost like a type of a Sanhedrin, where they had a rabbinic council dealing with the Jews in Ashkenaz. That existed until 1764, which is essentially when Poland was divided. But for that almost 200 years, there was something called the Council of Four Lands. The greatest rabbis of the time were members of it, and they basically dealt with the Jewish communities and Jewish law, and they were the sources for that. Well, at the same time this was going on in the 16th century, we also find that Jews were expelled from various places in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany. And this leads to Jews going to different places, including going to Eastern Europe. Okay? Places like Hungary start having people. Hungary was actually under the Ottomans for a while. Hungary, different places in Europe, Slovakia, all these places start getting people coming to them during this period of time. So in the 16th century, there are a number of extremely important people that are there this time that have an extremely important effect on our understanding of Noahide law. Okay, first is the Marshal Shlomo Luria. He was an important Talmudist, or the book Yam Shel Shlomo. He lived from 1510 to 1573 in Lithuania. From 1520 to 1575, Moshe Isserles, better known as the Mu, Moshe Isserles, he is most importantly known for his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. What happened is when we get to the Sparta, I probably should mention, there's some Kara put together from the Torah Shulchan Aruch. He compiled everything into simplified it into the halachas. The problem was that when he made the Shulchan Aruch, he chose out from three rabbis to choose out who he's going to follow as far as the final decision: the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. Now the problem is that two of them are Sephardim and one was Ashkenaz. So that there are times where they would all agree, obviously. Out of many things they do agree. If you're in the Shulchan Aruch, see a lot of agreement. But there are some times where the custom on the Sephardim did one way and the Ashkenazim did differently. Or there were customs additions to these things that were there that the Ashkenazim had that were different from Sephardim. And because of that, the Ramu wrote the Shulchan, the Yosef Kali wrote a work called Shulchan Aruch, means a set table. Shulchan means a set table. And the Moshe Isserles, the Ramu wrote a work on that called the Mappa. Mappa means a tablecloth, in order to add those things. And once those two things together were put together, it became a source that both the Jews in Europe and the Jews in Sephardic lands could use as a basis. Now, doesn't mean people followed it completely, slavishly like that. There were always local customs, also different things that leads to many different commentaries. But essentially, fundamentally, became eventually a source for both the Jews in Europe and in Sephardic lands. Okay, following this is another important person who, known for his moralistic literature, is the Maharal of Prague. Very famous person, 1520 to 1609. He lived obviously in Prague. Importantly, after another halachic figure is Mordechai Yaffa. He wrote the Levish, it's called the Baal Levish, and his are commentaries on the Talmud and halacha, very, very important and significant for the later time. Again, even though the Shulchan Aruch, there were people writing commentaries, and their commentaries get eventually put together, and sometimes there are changes. In Italy, which would, I think, Pano, I think is in Italy, Nachum Azaria, 1548 to 1620. His importance is that he wrote moralistic things, he wrote things on the Talmud, but also he's an important figure in the tradition of Kabbalah. The Kabbalah tradition, especially the Kabbalah from the Arizal, Isaac Luria, which we're going to mention when we get to Sfardim, he is a conduit from the Kabbalah that comes in Israel, Sfas, we're going to get to all this up, and goes into Europe, eventually becomes the foundations in Europe for Kabbalah, which both the Vilna Gaon, who was a Kabbalist, and the Hasidim who were Kabbalists, it comes into their traditions. Okay, after that, we'll do 1555 to 1614 is Yehoshua Falek. He has a commentary on Choshen Mishpat, one of the sections of Shulchan Aruch. Following that, 1558 to 1616, Maram Lublin. He's important as a teacher. Lublin is a very big center in Poland, and he wrote things on Talmud and Halacha. Among the Sephardim, at this time, there are a number of important figures. Avadis Sfarno, 1475 to 1550, he lived in Italy, but again, Italy by this time in that area was mostly towards Sephardim. His commentary on the Bible, Sforno is a very important one. Exists in all the major, texts that keep the commentaries. After the Radvaz is a Talmudist, but also important for halacha. Radvaz has also a little commentary on the Mishnah Torah. We have the Radvaz, the Mishnah Torah. This is when he lived. He lived in Egypt. Okay, I will mention somebody not of great point. My Gabbai was a Kabbalist, and his works in Kabbalah were slightly before that of the Rizal, and so he's somewhat important. Next is from 1488 to 1575 is Joseph Karo. His family, of course, fled Spain when he was young. Lived in Sfat in Israel, in the Holy Land, and he's important for a number of things. He has three commentaries which are in halacha, which are extremely significant. I mentioned the Beis Yosef, a commentary on the Torah Shulchan Aruch. He has a commentary called Kesef Mishnah on the Mishnah Torah from the Rambam, and then he has a Shulchan Aruch where he took the format from the Torah, the four-part Torah with the chapters the same way, and he combined together and put together, basically following, as I mentioned before, the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush, which were the majority opinions that came down, and he did that. This is important work that came down at that time, extremely important. In next 1508 to 1593 was Moshe Alshech. Moshe Alshech was in the city of Tzfas. He was the rabbi who gave the drushas, the sermons every week. He has his biblical commentary is basically based on his sermons, very important person in that time. After that, in Egypt, from 1520 to 1595, was Betzalel Ashkenazi. He was the teacher of Isaac Luria in the revealed parts of the Torah, and he wrote important work significant, very significant, especially for the laws of business, called Shittu Mikabetzis, which is a commentary on the Talmud and is used extremely important for understanding the law as far as business law. Then let's go back to the Holy Land Tzfat. From 1522 to 1570, there was Moshe Cardavaro. He was known for works on moralistic work, whether Talmud Devorah was one, but mostly he's known for Kabbalah. The Kabbalah from the Ramak is extremely important. It is Priyali. He wrote a work called Sefer Pardes, which is basically a compendium where he went through all the views of the previous Kabbalists and purified them, because many of the Kabbalists from earlier approached Kabbalah as if it was like philosophy, and then they put their own views into it. Ramak, what he did is he weeded these out in the Sefer Pardes. This is fundamental because the Kabbalah that comes later from the Isaguria is built upon that. Okay, now 1533 to 1600. Eliezer Askari, he wrote a work called Sefer Chedaidim. It's a moralistic work, very important, Kabbalistic moralistic work, but it's extremely influential, both among the Sephardim and among the Ashkenazim. Specifically, the Hasidim learned it. It's one of those works that were universal. 1535 to 1572, again in Tzfas. These were Eliezer Askari lived in Tzfas. Also, Isaac Lurie from 1534 to 1572. He's basically the father of Kabbalah. Okay, until his time, basically the Ramak people in the Ramak, but basically with Isaac Lurie, his building on the Ramak, he is basically the father of Kabbalah in both Ashkenaz and Sephardim. All Kabbalah goes back to him. His works on the subject. Now, Chaim Vital, his Talmud, who lived from 1543 to 1620, he compiled the lectures from him. Okay, and that is the main source of Kabbalah. Many sources consider only learning Kabbalah from that sources. Okay, there's another rabbi important for the Kabbalah, Yisrael Sirik, who died in 1604. He has one or two teachings from the Isaac Lurie that Chaim Vital didn't have, that people see maybe small hints at it, but didn't have. And these were important because Yisrael Sirik was the founder of the Kabbalah that ends up in Europe. So we remember Menachem Azariah, he was a Talmud from Yisrael Sirik. And through that, Yisrael Sirik's Kabbalah comes into Europe and has a phenomenal influence of it. Many of the works of Kabbalah that were in Europe differed from those in the Sephardic lands only because of the insights that came from Yisrael Sirik. Okay, so that's the end of the 16th century. Okay, I'm going to make a break right here. Are there any questions? Okay, I'm thinking right now, we've been going for about an hour. I think what we'll do is let's end at the 16th century. And I guess the next time we'll go from the 17th century. Now, my intention is this. My intention is to go through the Achronim up until today, their importance. And then what I want to do after that is I want to step back. There are two fundamentally important groups of Jews from Ashkenaz that are interacting with Noahides. Those who would call from the school from the Vilna Gaon, we call them the Litvisha, the Yeshivas, and those from the Talmidim from the Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. These will be mentioned when they live, and these are the Hasidim. So I want to discuss each one of them a little bit, how they develop. The yeshiva is important. Yeshivas like today, there's Yeshiva Mir, Yeshiva Panovitz. What about Yeshiva in Lakewood? Where's Yeshiva in Lakewood? There's Yeshiva in Baltimore. Very important Rosh Yeshivas. All of these people want to know where they come from. Okay, and these people will be somewhat different from the Hasidim. And the Hasidim, what about Lubavitch? Everybody says, well, where do I come? I come from a totally different thing. Where do these people all come from? Give a little bit of an idea and a flavor of what's going on, because these influence, of course, who you're speaking to. And also, there's a lot of things that's very important to know with the Jewish world in general. So I think I'm going to stop it right now at the end of the 16th century, because we're getting into some very important things. We already see at the end of the 16th century, basically the build up to the most important thing. Number one, Torah Judaism in Poland. Poland becomes basically the center. Poland, Russian Poland. You'll find out a little bit later. That area where my ancestors came from, that becomes very important. Okay, that's European Jewry. There are other areas we can find about Germany, which we mentioned that a little bit later, where Jewish learning was much lower. Okay, so we find that there. And then in Sephardic lands, we're now seeing the growth of Torah in the Holy Land. Okay, and that's going to be very important. So again, not too many Sephardim get involved in Noahides, but again, it's important to know about that. So I see this has pretty much been a lecture rather than discussion, unfortunately, but hopefully the next session when we start getting people you know about, you can start asking more questions. It's important to know some of these names. A takeaway from here, it's important to know names like the Rambam. He lived in Spain during the time when there was Islamic persecution. He had to leave there. The Ramban lived under Christian Spain during the Reconquest. Many important names, Chavis Lububis, which we mentioned, he lived in Islamic Spain. And many of the names up the Rif. These are names that should come up, okay? As far as Ashkenaz, Rashi, of course, Tosfos is very important to understand because it's very important as far as Noahides are concerned. The Torah, the Arbiturum, the Russian Arbiturum is very important to remember. And the development afterwards, which becomes the Shulchan Aruch and the commentary on Shulchan Aruch. These are fundamental understanding because we see a tradition going down again, halacha tradition going down again and again, getting to the 16th century, which we're ending today. So we only covered about 500 years. The next 500 years are going to be a little bit more. But
active years, though.
We see what's going on. And again, we see politically, socially what's going on. Right now, the 16th century, we've seen a major change in the center of learning. Okay, it's now moved to Poland and Eastern Europe. Okay, it's now moved from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, with these changes, it was a recognition that, one second, we are not like those communities before. The traditions have been moved. Things are not the same. Okay, it's one of the things about halacha. We see the honesty of rabbis recognizing, what they have the authority to, where they realize, what, we are just not like these guys anymore. We can't disagree with them. Okay, we can follow the custom from this place, but we no longer are on that type of level that we could say, hey, I don't agree with this guy. I don't agree with what he's saying. Okay, so that's very important to understand. When it comes to Jewish learning, I'm sure in your Christian background, you don't see that saying, these guys were much more spiritual. I can't talk.
No defect admitted to there.
Everybody believes it. But in Judaism, we recognize that we're not Moshe. He got the Torah directly. We're not Rabbeinu Kodesh who wrote the Mishnah. We recognize where it is and where our limitations are. And again, this is all part of the process. Remember, it goes back to the Torah, where it says that you're supposed to choose out judges who are people who honesty is extremely important. People who are honest, recognizing their own limitations, and follow principles of how you're supposed to follow halacha from generation to generation, majority will. Like when the Beis Yosef wrote the Shulchan Aruch, his principle was he took out the three biggest authorities that there were, the Rosh, the Rambam, and the Rif, and the majority rule. Majority rule is something that became accepted by the judges from a long time ago, that this is where we're going to decide decisions. When there's disagreements, we would follow the majority. And that, until this day, that's what goes on. So basically, that's it. Cal mentioned it's important to understand that a later rabbi cannot fundamentally disagree with the previous generation. Okay? There are sometimes exceptions. Certain rabbis will do it, but it's not. Your local rabbi will not do it. And then we're going to get down to what local rabbis are like. So it'll be, we're going to get down to your local Chabad rabbi, something like where they fit into this whole, and even where I fit into those things. Okay, I'm not from the Gedolim. Okay, I happen to be, my area of learning that I specifically, have concentrated on is Noahide law, among other things. But people have to know where you are, and that's extremely important. And Noahides have to know that choosing a rabbi who also knows. Okay, so anyway, that's what it is. We're now up to the 16th century. We've covered another from the 11th to the 16th century, which is 500 years. And from the 16th to the 21st century, 20th century, I don't think we're going to have anybody who's still alive in the 21st century, although it's 20 years into it because it's, but we'll hit them there. Okay, anyways, that's it. If there are any questions, again, I understand it's history. It's not much for discussion, but still, the next session I think we'll have, and I guess it'll be in May then, we'll have it. And anytime in May we can have it because the material, of course, I have all the material together. Moshe Steinbuch, yes. Moshe Steinbuch is, Moshe Steinbuch is on the Noahides. He is somebody from the post-war period, basically. A very important rabbi. He is not well. He's from the older rabbis. We are, again, in my age, I've seen people when I was younger who were from the older rabbis, either not here anymore, and again, we'll get to what we're going to mention people from there. But he's from the Noahides in Yerushalayim, a very important rabbi. Okay, so let me stop the recording.